This is Elizabeth Auchincloss again, and this is episode 5 of the Psychoanalytic Model of the Mind. Today we will talk about the structural theory of the mind. In fact, we will talk about the structural theory of the mind in episodes 5, 6, and 7. Today we will also talk about the concept of the ego. The structural model of the mind is the second model of the mind. It was invented by Freud in 1923 and rolled out in his book, The Ego and the Id. It has also been called by the name of ego psychology or conflict theory and is roughly synonymous with the term classical psychoanalysis or even the term Freudian psychoanalysis. Famous ego psychologists whom you might have heard of include Anna Freud, Heinz Hartmann, and Erik Erikson. The structural model of the mind improves on the topographic model of the mind, which was found to have many inconsistencies. It also has some things in common with this earlier model. The structural model of the mind was invented because many people, including Freud, began to question whether the best way to understand mental life was to explore it along topographic lines. Instead, it was thought that mental life and mental struggles could best be understood not as the conflict between conscious and unconscious domains of the mind, but instead as the result of the interaction between three structures of the mind, the ego, the id, and the superego, hence the structural model of the mind. You have all heard of the ego, the id, and the superego. In episodes 5, 6, and 7, we will explain what they are and what they can help us to understand about ourselves and others. These three structures can be differentiated from one another by their topographic features, which, if you recall, has to do with which aspect of the mind has access to consciousness. These three structures can also be differentiated from one another by their motivation, their structural properties and their modes of functioning, and their development. They also result in a revised theory of psychopathology and treatment. In other words, we can define these three structures using our 5 basic parameters along which every model of the mind should be looked at. If you want to jump ahead, you can see foreshadowing of what we talk about in table number 7. But basically and briefly, before we go into greater detail, the id is the name of the wishful force in human life. It is defined as entirely unconscious. The superego is the name for the moral imperative and ideals that we commonly call the conscience. It has both conscious and unconscious aspects. And the ego is the name of the executive function of the mind, responsible for self-regulation or managing conflict among id, superego, and the demands of external reality, and it's in charge of adaptation to reality. It also has both conscious and unconscious aspects. In the rest of this episode, we will discuss the ego in more detail. In episode number 6, we will discuss the id and the superego, and in episode 7, we will discuss what the structural model of the mind can teach us about ourselves and about our suffering. We will also discuss revisions to understanding how treatment works. We will revisit the case of Mr. K and see how the structural model of the mind helps us to understand this man better. This brings us to a new important concept of the ego, or the executive function of the mind. As we talk about the ego, you can review what we say in table number 5. Among the important contributions of the structural model of the mind is a greater emphasis on our capacities for self-regulation. A second important contribution of the structural model of the mind is a greater emphasis on our capacity for adaptation to reality. Although these capacities are present in the topographic model of the mind, with the concept of a sensor capable of judgment and delay, they will be given a great deal more attention in the structural model of the mind with the new concept of the ego. The structural model of the mind spells out more clearly what are called ego functions, including the capacity for cognition, perception, memory, motility, thinking, language, symbolization, reality testing, evaluation, impulse control, defense, representation, affect, and affect tolerance, to mention only a few. The structural model of the mind marks a vast improvement over the topographic model of the mind in terms of delineating conflicting motivations, explaining how we arrive at compromises, and explicating those ego functions necessary for forging compromises. We will explore the concept of conflict, defense, and compromise in greater detail in Episode 7, when we talk more about conflict and compromise. The structural model of the mind also marks a vast improvement over the topographic model in terms of delineating how we adapt to reality. The topographic model of the mind does have something to say about our need to fit in with external reality, in that it does propose that unconscious wishes are frequently in conflict with the demands of society as perceived by consciousness. However, the topographic model of the mind conceptualizes these demands and offerings of external reality rather vaguely and poorly. The structural model of the mind adds the concept of reality testing, which as an ego function can now be explored in greater detail. It also adds important concepts of internalization and identification, processes by which we take in aspects of the external world during development. Identification, by the way, is defined as the alteration of the self-image in response to internalizing the traits of others. We will see other important aspects of internalization and identification as the psychoanalytic model of the mind develops, to include object relations theory, see Episode 8, and self-psychology, see Episode number 9. Finally, the structural model of the mind marks a vast improvement over the topographic model in terms of how we understand psychopathology and treatment. Delineation of various ego functions allows clinicians to give a richer description of mental health expressed in terms of ego strength or ego weakness. We saw how in the topographic model of the mind, neurotic psychopathology was understood as representing the inflexible, stereotyped influence of unconscious conflict. The goal of treatment was to make the unconscious conscious. In the structural model of the mind, neurotic psychopathology can now be understood as the ego's maladaptive efforts to form a compromise from competing aims. In this new model, the aim of treatment is to explore how these compromises are made and to strengthen the ego. This leads to the well-known phrase, "Where id was, there ego shall be." As we said, this will be discussed further in Episode number 7. This ends Episode number 5 and our discussion of the ego. For a review of what we've said, see Table number 5. See you in the next episode for a discussion of the id and the superego.